A particular poem from Emily Dickinson has affected me quite deeply. I have decided to share my feelings about it. Let me first read it and then let you see some of the impact this poem has had on me. Just one poem, if it is from a great poet, can literally be a life-changing event. This is poem number 79 from Emily Dickinson. Going to heaven? I don't know when. Pray do not ask me how. Indeed, I'm too astonished to think of answering you. Going to heaven? How dim it sounds. And yet it will be done, as sure as flocks go home at night unto the shepherd's arm. Perhaps you're going too? Who knows? If you should get there first, save just a little space for me, close to the two I lost. The smallest robe will fit me, and just a bit of crown. For you know we do not mind our dress when we are going home. I'm glad I don't believe it, for it would stop my breath. And I'd like to look a little more at such a curious earth. I'm glad they did believe it, whom I have never found since the mighty autumn afternoon I left them in the ground. In the background of this poem, obviously, two little children have died. It happened some time ago, more we do not need to know. Certainly in the 1800s and before that time, the 1800s is when Emily was alive. It was more common than now that children would die in multiples. Various diseases could invade a household. It sometimes even happened in larger numbers, two at a time for sure, quite often. That would happen. But somehow, somewhere, the topic of going to heaven has now arisen. Perhaps at a casual dinner party, or in the vestibule of a church, or perhaps the front porch of a funeral home. Someone may have been quietly whispering their hopes about such a thing. Maybe someone tried to comfort a grieving parent with such an idea. The poet jumps right into the center of this conversation. The poem begins very abruptly. Going to heaven, she exclaims, with an exclamation mark. The first line all by itself is already very amazing. For people often feel that we should be super discreet about topics like religion or faith or sensitive subjects. But Emily plops right down into the middle of it right off the bat. Going to heaven, she exclaims. She says she does not know when that might happen, nor how. I don't know when, she writes. Pray do not ask me how. Many people throughout history have discussed the ambiguity of heaven's location. Also, the obscurity of all the logistics surrounding God. Where, how, when. These topics have become some of the casualties of our scientific spirit, the recent history of thought. But Emily also goes on to say that she is too astonished to even think about this whole topic of going to heaven. She finds it hard to imagine what to say in response to the whole idea. It's like she is shocked that you brought up the topic. She does confide how dim it sounds. Dim is an absolutely perfect word here. Very apt. Heaven, God, transcendence, ultimate meaning, our final goal, our destination. It has all become blurry and faint in the wake of modern science and our secular age. Heaven has become dim. Poets have the responsibility to find the best words. Dim is an incredibly good word here. It's an amazing choice. However, in this first verse, at least, the poet still seems, slightly at least, on board with the plausibility of the whole notion. She doesn't say she necessarily believes it, but she affirms, and yet it will be done, as sure as flocks go home at night, unto the shepherd's arm. There's still something personal about potential religiosity in that rendition, a shepherd. But also, if we as readers are honest, something somewhat ominous now occurs. The poetic introduction of nighttime, the feeling that the sheep do indeed have to find shelter as the darkness descends. Urgency creeps into the poem. We certainly will all die someday. It will be done. Flocks go home at night unto the shepherd's arm. It is true, we will all die someday. In the second verse, the poet abruptly turns the discussion back onto us as readers. Emily suggests this ethereal topic of heaven can actually never just be a one-way conversation. It urgently needs to be a dialogue. Perhaps you are going to heaven also, she inquires. I mean, you brought it up, but are you going? The reader of this poem, in other words, cannot just watch someone else think about an issue like heaven, but needs to tackle the topic on their own. What actually are people thinking while they read a poem like this one? Don't worry about what I think or about what Emily thinks. Just for yourself, what do you actually think about this kind of topic? Perhaps you think you are going there. Perhaps you don't. Maybe you have strong opinions about whether it even exists. Where are you at? This topic is profoundly a matter for interpersonal communication, not for hush-hush. But then she adds, who knows? Who knows? The entire history of agnosticism is bound up in those two simple words. Who knows? The poet hits the nail on the head with clairvoyant focus, as Emily does so often. If people are going to have this entire conversation about heaven and about getting there somehow, one thing they all need to admit to each other is that they collectively are mired in an epistemological deficit. Who knows? actually no one knows. We do not know. We have not seen it. We haven't been there. Even Jesus once said, no one has ever seen God. At this point, the poet introduces an almost teasing tone of voice, though it cannot actually be called harsh. It's not sarcastic, but it might be heading towards polemics. If you get there before me, she suggests, save me a spot, close to the two I lost. This is the reader's first realization that two little children have died. Parents and children will often play with clothes. Dress up is a favorite game in almost every culture, playing house, playing with clothes. And when people truly feel at home, when they are relaxed at play, they can easily abandon themselves to such a joyous and simple frivolity. We've even had the famous TV show, Mr. Dress Up. If heaven is going to be humanity's final home, people should not have to worry too much about what they will be wearing when they arrive, such as the white raiments of the saints, often mentioned in the Bible. Intimidating ideas like perfection or needing to qualify, being saved or whatever. Those kinds of ideas are not welcome at this point in the poem. The poet is apparently beginning to unveil a subtle and yet devastating critique of the whole notion of heaven. The smallest robe will fit me, and just a bit of crown. For you know, we do not mind our dress when we are going home. The reader can now easily visualize the mother or father and the children at some point in time preceding the intrusion of death, playing with costumes, having fun. Perhaps, suggests Emily, this jolly atmosphere is not actually going to be the case in the esteemed destination. Are we actually going to have any fun when we get there? There were moments when parents and children were actually having a wonderful time down here, but will everything truly be okay up there? Is heaven actually the home to which the reader wants to go, or which is actually awaiting the reader? The whole doctrine has been so mixed up with concepts of sin and sanctification, purity and judgment, who's in, who's out, that it almost becomes a dreary topic rather than a hopeful thought. The poet has quietly cast a deep shadow by hinting at all the baggage. Why should there ever have been doubts about how to qualify for getting into heaven? You know, we do not mind our dress when we are going home. The mother or father or parent in general almost envisions herself as a little child again, playing with her kids as equals, because she too, though she's grown up, needs only a really small outfit and a wee little bit of crown. Set aside some of these toddler outfits, she requests, if you get there before me. The protagonist was a kid, after all, when playing with their kids. The adult felt like a child at such times, like one of their own children. The third and last verse now starts with a different tone. An open declaration about the unlikely event of heaven. I'm glad I don't believe it. No more ambivalence is needed. The poet is now showing her full hand. But this clarity about heaven and the human destination is juxtaposed a few lines later in reference to the deceased and absent children. I'm glad they did believe it. This combination of feelings, first, the feeling of being relieved that one is no longer besieged with these heavenward thoughts, while at the same time not begrudging the acclamation of faith to anyone else, especially little children. This combination of feelings is likely the most prevalent combination in the last 2 or 3 centuries, while secularism has taken root. Defiant unbelief is not part of the common picture in our general day-to-day life anymore. Neither is the judgmentalism of heaven, the doctrinal or exclusionary ideas about heaven and who gets in or not. Many, many people have moved past these judging or defiant dynamics, it seems to me. It is intriguing and quite powerful and very moving, actually, that the poet is not shouting, "I don't believe it," but expresses the more disarming and self-effacing, "I'm glad I don't believe it." The poem is then not primarily an invitation to a skirmish, but an invitation into the inner recesses of the reader's own heart. The belief system has slipped away, and actually, truth be told, I feel okay about this, suggests the poet. I am peaceful with respect to this change. I'm glad I don't believe it. I'm relieved. I feel whole. But childlike faith, I'm glad they did believe it. I'm not rejoicing about the loss of faith anyone else incurs, especially if it would be little children. The poet is basically saying it's okay for me that I am no longer in the religious zone, so to speak. But if some others are still like that, especially little children, I'm not here to necessarily sabotage all of that. I mean, she would obviously hate anything that damages children, like notions of hell and damnation. But if there is a childlike trust in some kind of beautiful heaven, well, okay, I'm glad they did believe it. The speaker in the poem, the mom or dad or whomever, also adds that rather than going to heaven, at least right now, she would like to spend more time on our own planet, finding out whatever we can still find out yet. I'd like to look a little more at such a curious earth. I'd like to look a little more at such a curious earth. This amazing double entendre succinctly captures the entire history of science. The earth itself invites human exploration. It is a curious place. Our planet is a habitat we as readers would like to understand better. Where are we? What is this? But double entendre, this earth itself has also been curious, or at least human beings have been curious about other things. Things like heaven, things not seen, perhaps even unseeable, like first principles, Platonic ideas, the foundations of ethics, whatever. The abrasive idea of going to heaven would actually be a bit of an interruption in the ongoing process of generalized earthly curiosity. The whole history of science and our generalized interest in anything and everything, curious earth. I'd like to look a little more at such a curious earth. What an incredible double entendre. This abrupt topic of heaven actually takes one's breath away, exclaims the poet. That gulp of astonishment, this loss of breath, is actually at the heart of all curiosity too, both in those who look upwards to heaven and those who look down towards the earth. Both the lab technician and the philosopher share that same initial gulp of astonishment. Both the theologians and the evolutionary biologists can relate to feeling curious. And the disappearance of breath, yet another double entendre, is also what happens at death. When we die, we stop breathing. But even the topic, discussing the topic, takes my breath away. It's such an incredibly surprising and curious topic. In all honesty, confides the poet, she would like to spend more time down here yet, attending to this curious earth. She does not wish to die quite yet. Two double entendres in rapid succession. We are dealing here with a world-class poet of the highest rank. Although the parent's children have preceded the parent through the gates of death, the mom or dad does not wish to join them there quite yet. The parent's life may be full of sorrow and grief in the aftermath, but they still want to find out many things on planet Earth and explore many realities. Indeed, they're even open to talking about radical ideas like heaven, unlikely as it may be. Let me now summarize what I have been hearing in this poem. This poem has basically covered the entire history of faith and all the intellectual changes ever since the Enlightenment, and the nature of agnosticism, and the whole history of science, and the essence of parenting, the joie de vivre of play, and the nature of polite dialogue between all the contemporary options in our civilization, and the complex business of rudeness versus discreetness in the area of religion. Incredible. And the poem then ends with these unforgettable words. I'm glad they did believe it, whom I have never found since the mighty autumn afternoon. I left them in the ground. It now becomes the reader's turn to have their breath stopped. It has become the reader who is now too astonished to answer the question. If the reader has entered the dialogue about heaven, are you going? As we were sincerely invited into the dialogue, are you going? And shame on us if we were too standoffish to enter this dialogue, too intellectually proud to talk about this type of topic. But now at the end, any conception of heaven that the reader might have had is dramatically and suddenly shaken to the core. We gasp. Our breath is taken away. Indeed, I'm too astonished to think of answering you. These deceased children will not be curious anymore. They are enveloped by the curious earth. But the mother herself is still curious. She keeps looking for them. Perhaps she longs to play dress up with them once again, but she cannot find them. Perhaps they are now playing hide and go seek. That, besides dress up, is the other ancient game which parents and children play in almost every culture throughout the world. Hide and go seek. Count to 100. See if you can find me. Along with the two incredible double entendres, Emily has successfully brought to mind two of the most common games that children play throughout the world, two universal global games, dress up and hide and go seek. The children cannot be found anywhere. Heaven has ebbed away. Heaven has receded. It is dim. But the reader will never be able to forget those last funeral type moments in the cemetery. This is the opposite of dim. This is incredibly vivid. That mighty autumn afternoon. The coffin is lowered. It is covered by soil. They are gone. I can't find them anymore. Ever since that day when I left them in the ground. And the poem had started out in such a fun and charming way, as if it would merely be a nice chat about heaven, bold banter about topics often treated in a hush-hush tone. Such a friendly after-dinner topic. Going to heaven? I don't know when. The poet puts out into the open what someone may have wanted to discuss in a politely innocent manner, or a completely naive manner, unaware how you are treading on the holy ground of someone's inestimable sorrow. Going to heaven, it will never happen. I left them in the ground. There were colors on the leaves. The beautiful fall season is also the season of death and decay. And it is cyclical. It keeps on coming and coming and coming. In my life over the years, I have certainly heard people say that they finally gave up all their heavenly ideas on the day they buried a child. Ever since that day. This poem is real. It's very real. It is truly unforgettable. We owe a debt of gratitude to this poem for opening our eyes, helping us to see, bringing potentially a deep sense of peace, a sense of permanent relief inside. We may be able to finally lose the preoccupation with heaven, which is perhaps not a healthy preoccupation. I'd rather look a little more at such a curious earth.